In the spring of 1858, in the flat cane country west of the Atchafalaya Basin, there stood a place the owners did not bother to hide behind polite language anymore. On county papers it was listed as Barlow Agricultural Stock and Labor Farm, St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. But among the enslaved, among wagon drivers, among traders who came in with ledgers and left with children, it had another name. The breeding farm. That was the truth of it. Not a plantation in the ordinary sense, not merely a field of stolen labor. It was a machine built to turn black bodies into inventory, women into forced production, men into controlled breeding stock, and children into future cash before they were old enough to understand the meaning of a locked gate. The records called them increase. The buyers called them lots. The law called them property. And this is how evil survives longest, by teaching itself to speak in clean, administrative words. By May of that year, rumors were already moving faster than the patrol horses. A major sale was coming, not a routine transfer. Not a handful of names read from a porch, a full clearing, children first. Small children sold south, older ones split by work potential. The babies assigned with their mothers only when it increased the final price. Everyone else broken apart by the arithmetic of white profit. Hundreds of children were about to disappear into that market. Inside the forge yard, where heat erased the distinction between sweat and suffering, Isaiah Reed worked iron from before dawn until long after dark. He was 36 years old in June 1858, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, thick-wristed, with burn scars crossing both forearms like old maps of violence. The overseer trusted him only because he was useful. That trust did not make him safe. It made him watched. Isaiah repaired the machinery of captivity. Shackles, hinge brackets, wagon rims, chain links, lock plates, restraint collars when they cracked. Iron staples driven into holding room beams. He knew the weight of every device used to keep black flesh in place. He knew which locks jammed in wet weather, which chains weakened if filed near the rivet, which hinge pins could be lifted quietly if someone had patience and a nail-thin sliver of metal. That knowledge had not made him free. It had made him dangerous in a way the owners had not fully measured. Across the yard and beyond the low nursery quarters was a woman named Eliza May Turner, 31 years old, born in Virginia, sold twice before 20, sent to Louisiana after her second child died during transport. By 1858, she was assigned to the children's barracks and the nursing shed, where infants, toddlers, and older children waited in staged rows of misery for feeding, cleaning, inspection, and eventual sale. She was not listed as a teacher, not listed as a nurse, not listed as kin to anyone. The ledger gave her one value only: female, sound, proven fertile. But Eliza May carried a different record in her head. She knew who belonged to whom. She knew which little girl still cried for a mother sold to Opelousas in March, which boy had stopped speaking after being whipped for clinging to his brother, which infant had been passed from woman to woman because the mother was forced back to work 3 days after birth. She knew the hidden family tree of the farm better than any clerk with a pen. She remembered what the owners required the world to forget. That memory would become a weapon. The farm itself was laid out with the logic of permanent control. Big house on the rise, breeding cabins farther back, nursery sheds near the smokehouse so crying would disappear into labor noise. Forge to the east side, where hammering covered other sounds. Mule barns, wagon lanes, feed stores, punishment posts, drainage ditches. At night, lanterns were hung in calculated intervals so no one could cross open ground without becoming a moving target. Every path had been designed by people who feared black escape more than they feared God. And yet the owners made one mistake common to all systems built on cruelty. They believed fear was enough. They believed if you starved people of hope long enough, you also starved them of organization. They mistook silence for surrender. They mistook obedience for ignorance. They mistook motherhood for weakness. They mistook labor skill for loyalty. By the second week of June, a draft sale ledger was whispered into existence before it was officially posted. That is how such places worked. White men believed information lived only on paper, but paper passed through hands. Hands belonged to clerks, kitchen girls, stable boys, seamstresses, laundresses, drivers. A list never stayed secret for long among people whose lives depended on hearing bad news before it became final. The number was not exact at first, 200, then more. Then nearly 300 children and adolescents marked for separation over the next 10 days. Some would go to New Orleans depots, some to Mississippi cotton, some to Texas stock farms, some would vanish into private purchases where even their names might not survive. This was not an accidental cruelty, it was policy, a controlled liquidation of young black life for cash flow after 2 poor harvest seasons and gambling debts tied to the Barlow family. Let that be remembered clearly. The sale was not driven by famine, not by storm damage, not by emergency. It was driven by white appetite, white debt, and the old American certainty that a black child could be converted into money faster than a conscience could object. Isaiah heard the first solid version of the list near sundown on June 14, 1858, when a wagon teamster brought damaged trace chains to the forge and muttered that traders from Baton Rouge were expected by month's end. Eliza May heard more the next morning when a frightened kitchen girl said she had seen 3 columns on the master ledger: age, condition, expected price. Children entered like livestock, no mother's name beside them, no mention of siblings, no space for grief. That same day, Eliza May watched one of the younger boys, Samuel, perhaps 6 years old, try to remember his baby sister's sleeping song because he believed he might need it, "Where They Send Us." A child speaking in logistics of separation. That is what the farm had done. It had trained children to anticipate loss the way other children anticipate rain. Something in Eliza May hardened permanently then. Before this, she and Isaiah were not allies. They were not enemies either. They belonged to different circles of survival. He kept his head down in the forge, spoke little, trusted less. She moved through women's spaces, feeding lines, washing corners, half-dark thresholds where truth traveled under breath. They knew each other by sight, by reputation, by the practical recognition of 2 people still alive inside a system designed to hollow them out. But when the scale of the sale became undeniable, distance became a luxury neither of them could afford. The first conversation happened behind the ash barrel outside the forge, after evening ration, under a sky so thick with summer heat that even the insects seemed angry. Eliza May did not approach like a friend. She approached like a witness delivering an indictment. "They're taking the little ones first," she told him. Isaiah did not answer immediately. He kept scraping a metal edge clean, as if the shape of the tool might change the words. "How many?" he asked. "Too many to pretend it ain't a clearing." He looked at her then. "Who told you?" "Enough people." That was how truth moved among the enslaved, not through official proof. Through convergence. Through repeated terror from separate mouths, until denial became another form of cowardice. Eliza May told him what she knew. Nursery groups being recounted, body inspections increasing, extra wagons requested, cloth tags prepared for children who could not keep track of names. Isaiah said what he had noticed. Chain orders rising, locks rekeyed on 2 rear sheds, Overseer Bracken spending more time near the forge inventory, new staple hooks being ordered for wagon interiors. Each held one piece of the same crime. One had tools, one had people, one knew iron, one knew children. And somewhere between those facts, in the heat and cinder smell of that June evening, the first shape of resistance began to form. Not a grand speech, not a miracle. Those belong to fiction that wants suffering to be beautiful. This was uglier, more practical, and therefore more real. 2 enslaved people standing inside an engine of sail, measuring whether there was still enough time to break 1 gear before it crushed 300 lives. Isaiah asked the question plainly. "If there's movement, can your women sort them quiet?" Eliza May answered just as plainly. "If there's a way out, I can have every child grouped before moon high." There it was, the alliance. No oath. No handshake, just the exchange of capabilities under mortal pressure. From that night forward, the breeding farm was no longer holding only despair. It was holding a conspiracy, and the owners, like so many before them, had failed to understand the oldest truth of all. When people are treated as property long enough, memory itself becomes rebellion. So listen closely now, and remember their names. Isaiah Reed, the blacksmith forced to maintain the iron of bondage. Eliza May Turner, the mother who kept account of children the ledger tried to erase. The sale had not yet begun, but the counting had. If you're listening from anywhere in the world, comment your country, city, or town below, and stay with this story, because the names they tried to bury deserve to be spoken out loud. By June 16, 1858, the Barlow breeding farm was operating exactly as such places were designed to operate, with routine so brutal it could pass for order. That is how large crimes sustain themselves. Not only through whips and rifles, but through schedules, assignments, feeding bells, repair logs, inventory marks, and the daily repetition of tasks meant to make human violation look ordinary. Isaiah Reed's day began before first light in the forge yard on the eastern side of the property. The iron shop stood low and hot beside the wagon lane, close enough to the mule barns for broken hardware to be delivered quickly, and far enough from the main house that the noise of hammering would not disturb White's sleep. He was expected at the bell, usually around 4:30 in the morning during summer months, when the sky over St. Landry Parish was still dark and the damp heat already sitting low over the fields. By sunrise he would have the coal bed alive, the tongs arranged, the small riveting hammer laid beside the heavy one, the water barrel checked, and the workbench cleared for the day's chain repairs. The slaveholders called him skilled. What they meant was profitable. Isaiah repaired the physical grammar of captivity. He reset bent shackles after punishment details. He straightened wheel rims for the transport wagons used during field transfers and auctions. He forged staple rings for holding sheds. He repaired padlock housings from storehouses and child barracks. He sharpened iron hooks, hinges, draft pins, axle straps, and bolt plates. When restraints came back bloodied, cracked, or half-torn from panic, they were brought to him as if they were no different from broken plow hardware. That, too, must be remembered. Slavery was not merely cruelty in moments of spectacle. It was a maintenance system. It required craftsmen. It required tools. It required men to be forced into preserving the very mechanisms that held their own people down. The overseer, Martin Bracken, relied on Isaiah's hands while fearing his mind. Bracken was 43 in 1858, lean, horse-faced, methodical, a man whose greatest talent was not rage but surveillance. He checked inventories personally every third day. He counted files, cold chisels, spare keys, and lengths of scrap iron. He watched for signs of theft, not because he respected property in principle, but because he knew any missing metal on such a farm could turn into leverage, a blade, a pry bar, or freedom. He had no illusions about what a blacksmith represented inside a prison disguised as agriculture, so Isaiah learned to survive inside scrutiny. He spoke little. He kept no obvious friends. He never stared too long at doors or locks when white men were near. He accepted orders with the practiced stillness of a man who understood that visible anger was often a death sentence. But under that discipline sat memory. He knew which hinges had sagged on the nursery doors. He knew the rear grain shed still used older warded locks installed in 1854. He knew the axle noise of the hay wagons and how much weight they could carry without splintering on wet ground. He knew where iron failed first under strain. Such knowledge was not abstract. On a place like Barlow's, knowledge of metal was knowledge of possibility. Across the property, Eliza May Turner's day began in a different kind of labor zone, one deliberately softened in appearance, so white visitors could pretend the farm possessed humanity. The nursery quarter stood beyond the women's cabins and near the smokehouse lane, a row of plank structures with narrow windows and packed dirt walkways that turned to mud after rain. Here infants were bundled, children washed, bodies examined, fevers measured, names shortened, kinship blurred, and loss made routine. The owners preferred women like Eliza May in that space because they believed motherhood could be exploited as unpaid management. Again, note the structure of the crime. Enslaved women were forced not only to birth children into bondage, but to organize, soothe, and maintain the next generation of property for sale. The same arms that held a child in comfort were expected to present that child for inspection. The same voice that sang a baby to sleep might be ordered to quiet him before a trader entered. This was not incidental cruelty. It was institutional desecration. Eliza May was assigned to the younger children because she was steady under pressure and remembered details others missed. That made her valuable to the farm and indispensable to the enslaved mothers. By June 1858, she knew the barracks by breath and footstep. She knew which floorboards creaked near the far crib row, which toddlers wandered when frightened, which older girls could carry infants without waking them, which boys wet themselves when the auction wagons rolled in. She kept unofficial track of birth months, nursing mothers, sibling ties, and nighttime fevers. The white clerk reduced children to age categories. Eliza May kept the truth. Who belonged together, who still had a living mother on the property, who had already been half destroyed by an earlier sale. On most mornings, she supervised feeding with two other women, Ruthie and Dinah, both older and both carrying their own ledger of grief. Corn mush first for the toddlers, water pails refilled, cloth wraps checked. Infants passed in a sequence the owners mistook for domestic routine. In reality, it was an intelligence network disguised as care work. Women exchanged warnings while wiping faces, tying headcloths, or settling quarrels between frightened children. A glance toward the lane could signal trader movement. A change in ration count could reveal an upcoming transfer. An extra laundry order might mean guests expected from New Orleans or Baton Rouge. Information moved in small fragments because open speech was dangerous, but fragments repeated carefully enough become strategy. The children themselves lived under a schedule so harsh it trained them early in the mechanics of commodification. Older children were separated by probable labor use. The strongest boys, even at 9 or 10, were evaluated for field potential. Girls were watched for temperament, by which white buyers meant obedience, endurance, and future reproductive value. Smaller children remained in supervised clusters so they could be counted efficiently. By late June, when auction season intensified, some were washed more often and issued cleaner garments for inspection days. Even their cleanliness was not mercy. It was presentation. Eliza May saw all of it. She saw how children learned to read white footsteps before they learned to read words. She saw how mothers stopped asking why and started asking when. She saw boys trying not to cry because they had already understood that crying could mark them as troublesome. She saw girls soothing babies they were old enough to be siblings to, because the actual mothers had been sent to hoe lines or breeding cabins. This is the part history must never allow to blur. Slavery did not only steal labor, it reorganized tenderness itself into service for the market. By June 18, 1858, the sales apparatus was becoming more visible. Additional tags were prepared in the counting room. 2 covered wagons from Opelousas had been requested for end-of-month movement. Bracken increased evening headcounts in the children's quarter. The clerk, Vernon Pike, spent longer in the nursery lane with his ledger open, sometimes stopping to inspect teeth, arms, or posture as if measuring livestock. Eliza May recognized what those longer inspections meant before anyone announced it outright. The list was narrowing. The chosen children were being sorted for value. Isaiah, meanwhile, saw another side of the same preparation. New lock orders were issued for side gates. Wagon brakes were checked. Chain lengths were measured for transport restraints. Bracken ordered damaged links examined after noticing 2 had been filed thin near the join. That discovery did not yet reveal resistance, but it sharpened suspicion. Isaiah understood immediately that the forge would now be watched harder. Every tool he touched, every scrap he kept, every minute he spent alone would matter. And yet this pressure also clarified the farm's weak points. Systems designed for mass control often become predictable under stress. Isaiah noticed that Bracken's stricter counts focused on obvious tools: full saws, standard files, large key blanks. Small offcuts attracted less notice. Slivers, rivet fragments, bent wire, nail-length pieces of flattened iron. These moved beneath the threshold of white alarm. Eliza May noticed that when inspections increased, the women were forced into more coordinated child handling, which meant they had legitimate reasons to cluster children by age and size without drawing immediate suspicion. What the owners considered tighter control was also, unintentionally, a rehearsal space. Neither Isaiah nor Eliza May spoke openly of escape in those first days after their alliance formed. That would have been foolish. Large plans do not begin with declarations, they begin with inventory. Who can move quietly? Who can carry? Who can keep children calm? Which doors matter? Which women can be trusted? Which older boys can follow signals? Which infants are too ill for long movement? Which wagons can bear hidden weight? Which routes flood after rain? Which paths patrols ignore because white men think mud itself is enough to prevent flight? That was the real work of June 18th through June 20th, 1858. Observation, silent counting, human mapping. Eliza May began to sort the children in her head not as the market sorted them, but as a rescuer would. Nursing babies. Toddlers likely to cry. Children old enough to walk 2 miles, 5 miles, or all night. Girls mature enough to help with swaddling. Boys strong enough to push wheels from ruts. She watched who listened well during songs, which ones moved when called by touch rather than name, which older children instinctively guarded the smaller ones. Every oppressive institution creates its own shadows, and in those shadows, oppressed people study each other for survival. Isaiah did the same with the forge and transport yard. He examined hinges without appearing to. He counted wagons in usable condition. He watched the hay carts return from field edges and noted which drivers drank too much after dusk. He timed the distance between bell ring and guard movement. He listened to the pattern of night patrol boots on the plank walk behind the children's sheds. He even noted the weather. June had been wet. Low trails near the cypress break were half choked with mud. That made fast pursuit difficult. It also made organized escape with children nearly impossible unless guided by someone who knew exactly where solid ground still held. This is what distinguished resistance from fantasy, not courage alone. Preparation. By the third week of June, the Barlow farm still looked, from a distance, like a functioning southern enterprise. Smoke rising. Wagons repaired, children fed, bells rung, accounts balanced, white men moving about as if mastery were natural. But inside that order stood two enslaved people already transforming the farm into something the owners had not intended. A blacksmith was no longer just repairing chains. A mother was no longer just tending children. They were counting what the ledgers refused to count. Loyalty, memory, roots, hands, silence, trust. And in a place built to erase black family, that quiet counting was already an accusation. By June 21, 1858, the alliance between Isaiah Reed and Eliza May Turner had moved beyond fear and into calculation. That is the threshold that matters in stories like this. Terror alone does not stop a machine. Shared terror, turned into method, sometimes can. The Barlow breeding farm in St. Landry Parish was still functioning in outward calm. Bells rang on schedule. Wagons crossed the yard. The forge fire stayed lit. Children were counted at dawn and again before dark. White men continued to move through the property with the confidence of people raised to believe that violence, when legalized, becomes order. But under that surface, two separate worlds were beginning to touch. Isaiah belonged to the world of iron, tools, hinges, chains, carts, and gates. Eliza May belonged to the world of women, infants, sleeping mats, wash buckets, feeding lines, lullabies, whispered kinship, and the internal map of children, the ledgers treated as detached units. Neither world alone could have moved hundreds of children. Together, they formed the first structure of organized defiance on the property. This did not begin with trust. It began with necessity. On the evening of June 21st, after the second ration bell, Eliza May crossed behind the forge shed carrying a broken wash pail handle as cover. The object in her hand was ordinary enough to justify her presence. That is how enslaved people survived long enough to resist, not by grand gestures but by hiding urgent purpose inside daily labor. Isaiah was at the rear anvil table sorting damaged rivets into usable and unusable piles. He did not greet her. Men in his position learned early that even the appearance of ease could invite suspicion. She told him what had changed in the nursery quarter. 3 older girls had been removed from their usual sleeping row and placed nearer the inspection shed. 2 nursing mothers had been ordered to keep infants cleaner than usual for several consecutive mornings. A boy named Amos, about 10 years old, had been told by the clerk to stand straight and open his hands during examination. These were not random acts. They were signs of category sorting. The children were no longer being managed merely as a population. They were being arranged as sale lots. Isaiah answered with what he had learned on his side of the farm. Bracken had ordered new side gate checks. The north wagon lane had been cleared of old timber piles, making movement easier for loaded carts. 2 spare padlocks had been issued to the child barracks and 1 old rear hasp fitting had been replaced. Again, this was the language of the machine. The owners did not announce their intent in moral terms. They announced it through hardware and placement. Sale preparation had a sound, a rhythm, and a material footprint. The enslaved had learned to read it because their survival depended on reading what white authority preferred to leave unspoken. That night, for the first time, Isaiah and Eliza May spoke not just about danger, but about roles. He had tools, she had people. He could affect barriers, she could affect movement. He could not guide 300 children. She could not open secured spaces fast enough. That was the shape of the alliance, 2 forms of competence meeting under pressure. Eliza May already knew which women might be trusted. Not all grief produces discipline. Not all rage produces silence. On a place like Barlow's, a single frightened word spoken to the wrong ear could destroy 20 lives. So she did not think in terms of friendship. She thought in terms of steadiness. There was Ruthie Cole, about 47, who worked the nursery wash line and had lost 2 sons in an 1854 sale to Natchez. Since then she spoke little, watched everything, and forgot nothing. There was Dinah Brooks, older still, with bad knees and a voice the children obeyed because it carried no panic. There was Miriam Tate from the women's sewing row, who could wrap an infant tight enough to keep the child warm and quiet through a night storm. There was Liza Ann, barely 20, but fast on her feet and calm under stress, often sent to fetch hot water because she did not spill when others did. These women were not helpers in any sentimental sense. They were part of a hidden labor force inside oppression itself. The same system that used them to maintain order had, over years, trained them in the practical management of children, bodies, routines, and emotional control. It is important to state this clearly. The institution tried to turn black care into unpaid support for captivity. In crisis, that same care became infrastructure for resistance. Eliza May began quietly testing them, not with open questions. That would have been reckless. She used fragments. If some children had to move after dark, who would carry the smallest? Which ones can walk without talking? Who wakes easy when doors shift? Such questions could pass, in the wrong hearing, as ordinary nursery concern. But among women who understood the texture of approaching catastrophe, they meant something else entirely. The answers came back with caution and precision. Ruthie said the twins from Cabin 9 must never be separated or they would cry until sick. Dinah said older girls should each be assigned one child, never two, because one free hand would be needed on muddy ground. Miriam said the infants should be grouped by nursing schedule, not age, because hunger would break silence faster than fear. These were not fantasies. These were field notes for survival. Isaiah, meanwhile, was testing a different network. Among the enslaved men, trust was harder and more fragmented. Labor assignments kept them separated. Punishment made examples of those who whispered too boldly. Still, he knew a few who could be measured for usefulness. Caleb Morse in the mule barn understood harnesses and wheel movement. Ezra Pike, no relation to the white clerk, worked the hayloads and knew which carts rolled quietest. Josiah Bell, one of the older field hands, had a limp but knew the drainage edge behind the north pasture better than any man on the place. Isaiah did not recruit them into a full plan, not yet. He asked narrower questions. Which hay wagon had the strongest axle? Which mule driver slept deepest after drinking? How long did the night patrol linger at the east fence before circling back? If a cartwheel sank near the low track, where was the nearest firm rise? Each answer became part of a map forming inside his head. By June 22nd, the Alliance had its first essential principle. Children could not move as one mass. They would have to be divided by age, mobility, and silence. That conclusion may sound obvious now. It was not simple then. Panic always tempts people toward one desperate push. But one desperate push with nearly 300 children would have become a trap. Too much noise. Too much confusion. Too many bodies lost at choke points. The farm itself had been built to punish crowds. So Eliza May and Isaiah began to think in clusters. Infants with experienced women. Toddlers with older girls. Children old enough to walk grouped in narrow files. A few stronger boys placed at the edges to help lift wheels or guide smaller ones through bad ground. Not equality of burden. Function. This is what moral seriousness looks like under slavery. Not speeches about liberty, but decisions about who can carry whom through mud and darkness while armed men search behind them. On June 23rd, another pressure point emerged. Bracken announced an unscheduled inspection of the forge inventory after breakfast. He found nothing open to accusation, but he lingered too long near the scrap bins and small tool shelf. Isaiah understood the warning. Suspicion had not attached to a person yet, but it was beginning to attach to possibility. Once an overseer starts imagining sabotage, even ordinary labor becomes evidence. That same afternoon, Eliza May saw a second warning. 2 children from the younger barrack row were moved temporarily to the isolation shed because of fever concerns. Illness on such farms was often real, but it also created disruption, new sleeping arrangements, extra counting, unfamiliar doors. If more children were shifted that way, any future movement plan would have to account for split locations. The window for preparation was narrowing. That evening, Isaiah and Eliza May met again, this time not behind the forge, but near the ash pit by the smokehouse lane, where odors and darkness covered presence better. Neither wasted words. He told her Bracken was watching the forge more closely. She told him the children's quarters were starting to shuffle. He asked, "Can your women hold if rooms change?" She answered, "If we know before night, yes." Then she asked the harder question. "If it starts early and not all are ready, do we move who we can?" There was no clean answer to that. People who talk cheaply about courage rarely speak honestly about selection. Under extreme oppression, rescue plans are forced into terrible arithmetic. Delay may doom all. Movement may leave some behind. This is where history must refuse comforting lies. Enslaved people were not offered noble choices. They were cornered into impossible ones. Isaiah did not answer quickly. He looked past her toward the nursery lane where dim lamplight touched the roof edge of the children's barracks. "If they post the list," he said at last, "then waiting is another way of handing them over." That was the moment the alliance hardened into commitment. Not hope. Not optimism. Commitment. From that point on, the question was no longer whether the farm deserved resistance. It did. The question was whether enough people could be aligned fast enough, quietly enough, and precisely enough to break the sale before the traders arrived. Eliza May began using routine songs differently, not as coded poetry, something simpler, safer. Sequence. A second verse repeated longer meant delay. A cut-short ending meant gather children closer. A hymn begun earlier than usual signaled women to remain near assigned sleeping rows. Nothing theatrical, just pattern adjustments inside normal sound, subtle enough not to draw white notice but clear enough to steady those already alert. Isaiah did something similar with objects. A bent hook placed left instead of right. A hanging strap looped twice instead of once. A certain length of chain left draped over the back peg near the forge door. Small markers. Not enough to prove conspiracy if discovered, but enough to communicate readiness to the few watching for it. This is how resistance often survives under heavy surveillance. It shrinks itself beneath the threshold of white imagination. The enslavers expected rebellion to look loud, dramatic, male, and immediate. They were less prepared for rebellion that looked like childcare routine, forge clutter, feeding order, or the rearrangement of ordinary things. By June 24, 1858, Isaiah Reed and Eliza May Turner were no longer merely sharing information. They were building a covert labor system inside the official one. Women in the children's quarter were beginning to understand their probable functions. A handful of men near carts and barns were being measured for usefulness without being told everything. Older children were being quietly observed for stamina and obedience under pressure. No document recorded this. No white witness saw the full shape of it. That too must be remembered. The most important acts of black coordination under slavery often passed unseen, not because they were small, but because the people in power never truly believed the enslaved could think at scale while under constant coercion. That arrogance would become their blindness. And on the Barlow farm, blindness was beginning to spread among the very people who believed they controlled every gate. By June 25, 1858, the conspiracy at Barlow Agricultural Stock and Labor Farm had entered its most dangerous phase, preparation without exposure. This is where many such efforts failed, not at the moment of movement, not at the first sound of alarm. They failed in the days before, when too many hands touched the plan, too many objects changed places, too many frightened people tried to do too much at once. Under slavery, secrecy was not a talent, it was a discipline learned under threat. Isaiah Reed understood that better than anyone in the forge yard. The overseer could count obvious tools. He could count files, chisels, hammers, lock blanks, pry bars. What he could not count so easily were absences small enough to hide inside wear and usage. So Isaiah did not steal what would be missed. He reduced what was already present. A sliver shaved from scrap, a thin strip cut from a damaged hoop. A nail hammered flat, then drawn longer. A bent hinge pin straightened and shortened. He worked in fragments because fragments were how enslaved people survived under inspection. From June 25th through June 27th, he began shaping the first practical instruments of escape, not weapons in the grand sense white men always feared. Tools. Quiet tools. He worked on narrow key slivers first. The older warded locks on the rear nursery doors were crude by design, meant to keep the enslaved contained, not to resist a skilled hand. Isaiah had handled enough of them to know their internal pattern by feel. He could not produce polished duplicates. That would have required time and metal consistency he did not possess. What he could make were rough turning pieces, thin enough to bypass the simplest wards if inserted with patience. They were not proper keys. They were chances. He kept them hidden where only a blacksmith would think to hide anything. Inside split-handle wood, wrapped in soot cloth under the slack stone near the quench barrel, once even pressed into the seam of a coal sack. He never stored them together. If one cache was found, the full intention would remain unclear. That was the logic of resistance under surveillance: divide the evidence, preserve the possibility. He also began preparing saw strips, again, not full blades. Thin sections cut from worn metal stock, rubbed down until they could be wrapped in cloth and concealed in a sleeve seam or under a sleeping mat. Such pieces would not cut through thick iron quickly. That was not their purpose. They were meant for smaller tasks: weakening a light staple, trimming a peg, shaving wood fast enough to widen a catch, sawing through rope or leather binding if needed. In a more just world, this would have been ordinary craftsmanship. On the Barlow farm, even a strip of sharpened metal became subversive because the law had criminalized black self-preservation. Isaiah marked signals too, but he did so with the caution of a man who knew that symbols could become a death sentence if they looked deliberate. A scratch near the underside of a hook. 2 shallow taps on one iron peg instead of one. A bent hanger turned inward rather than out. These were not codes in the romantic sense. They were prompts. Ready. Wait, not yet. Shift location. He chose forge objects because nobody but the workers looked at them twice. White oversight notices inventory totals. It often misses pattern. Across the property, Eliza May Turner was building a different network from materials that looked even more harmless. She used cloth first. Old wraps, feeding shawls, torn strips of nursery linen, headscarves worn thin at the fold. In the hands of a white mistress, cloth was housekeeping. In the hands of an enslaved mother organizing movement, cloth became classification, one type for nursing infants, another for older toddlers who needed to stay close to a leading hand. A darker wrap reserved for the women assigned to move near the rear lanes at night. Nothing written, nothing obvious, only textures and familiar pieces distributed to the right women so each could identify her role without a spoken briefing. Then came the lullabies. Here, the cruelty of the system turned against itself. The white owners had long depended on black women's songs to keep children quiet, comforted, and manageable. They heard the melodies and thought only of compliance. They never listened closely to timing. Eliza May understood that routine sound could guide without attracting notice. So she did not invent strange signals. She altered ordinary patterns. One verse repeated twice meant keep the little ones gathered near bedding. A feeding song started early meant women should remain in place after dark rather than drift back to their own cabins. A humming pause before the final line meant delay movement and wait for another cue. These were not dramatic codes from a novel. They were disciplined adjustments inside a soundscape the enslavers had trained themselves to ignore. She used feeding hours the same way. Morning corn mush, midday waterline, evening settling. Each routine allowed brief clustering by age, which she gradually shaped into more useful groupings. Infants nearest the steadiest carriers. Toddlers assigned mentally to older girls. Children 7 and above observed for walking endurance and silence. She did not announce these groupings because announcement would have shattered them. She simply repeated them until they felt natural. By the time danger came, the children would already be arranged in patterns that could move. That was the real genius of the preparation. It disguised emergency structure as habit. From June 26th onward, Eliza May relied heavily on 3 women: Ruthie Cole, Dinah Brooks, and Miriam Tate. Ruthie took responsibility for the children most likely to panic when separated from familiar adults. She knew which ones clung, which ones froze, which ones tried to run back toward voices they recognized. Dinah handled the older girls, drilling them without seeming to drill them. Stay close when lights go out. Lift from under the arms, not by the wrist. Never let the smallest stand alone in mud. Miriam focused on infants and cloth, making sure wraps could hold through a long, damp night and that no crying child went into darkness hungry if there was any way to prevent it. Again, it matters how we describe these women, not as passive sufferers. Not as saintly abstractions, as organizers under coercion. The institution reduced them to reproductive labor and nursery management. They turned those same imposed skills into a hidden transport system for children marked for sale. The children themselves were being prepared without fully understanding the scale of what was coming. That was unavoidable. A plan involving nearly 300 children could not be explained openly, and many were too young to hold fear without betraying it. So the preparation had to be physical, not verbal. Older girls were told to keep their shawls near at night. Boys old enough to walk distance were quietly reminded to help smaller ones when called. Toddlers were encouraged to sleep in the same places for several nights so they could be lifted quickly by familiar hands. A few of the calmest children were taught to respond to touch on the shoulder rather than to their names because names spoken in darkness could carry. These details may sound small, Under slavery, small details decided whether people vanished into the market or slipped beyond it, but the more carefully the plan took shape, the greater the pressure became. On June 27th, Overseer Martin Bracken inspected the forge more aggressively than before. He did not find a clear missing item, yet something had sharpened in him. Perhaps it was the filed chain links found earlier in the week. Perhaps the sale itself had made him more vigilant. Perhaps men who spend their lives policing others simply develop a second appetite for suspicion. He sifted scrap bins with his boot, lifted a coal sack, asked Isaiah why one hinge pin batch ran shorter than another. Isaiah answered with the plain irritability of labor: warped stock, reused pieces, rushed orders. The explanation was believable because exploitation always produces irregular work. That day, ordinary disorder protected him. Still, the inspection changed the atmosphere. Isaiah reduced metalwork for one night and shifted his attention to wooden pieces, strap loops, and wagon checks less likely to trigger notice. He understood the balance. Resist too slowly, and the sale would come first. Resist too visibly, and the plan would die in the forge. Eliza May faced a parallel threat on June 28th when two children were moved to the isolation shed after signs of stomach sickness. The shed stood slightly apart from the main nursery row and used a different latch. That mattered immediately. Every split location added difficulty. Every sick child added noise, delay, and moral burden. There is no clean version of this story, and there should not be. Rescue under slavery was not shaped by noble simplicity. It was shaped by fever, mud, hunger, timing, and impossible triage. That evening, near the smokehouse lane, Isaiah and Eliza May met again. He told her the forge was no longer safe for frequent hiding. She told him the children's quarters were no longer stable as one block. He asked how many women were now solid. She answered, "Enough to lead if the way opens." She asked how many doors he could influence. He answered, "Not all. Enough." That was as close as either came to confidence. By June 29, 1858, the framework was set. Isaiah had a handful of rough turning pieces, hidden saw strips, and marked iron prompts in place. Eliza May had grouped women and children through song, feeding order, and cloth distribution. Ruthie, Dinah, and Miriam each knew their probable burden. A few men near the wagons had been quietly steered toward readiness without hearing the full plan. The hay carts had been observed, their axle sounds memorized, their weight limits estimated. The rear paths had been reconsidered after rain. The weak points were known. The risks were known too. If one child cried at the wrong time, a whole row might be exposed. If one woman broke under fear, the nursery could be locked down before movement began. If Bracken found even one key sliver, the forge workers would be searched, questioned, separated, and likely removed. If the wagons bogged in low mud, the younger children might be trapped between speed and concealment. That is what preparation really means in such a story. Not confidence in success, clarity about failure. And yet, inside the Barlow farm, something morally decisive had already happened. The owners still believed they were arranging a sale. In truth, the people they meant to sell were arranging a counter-order beneath their feet. The forge, the nursery, the feeding line, the cloth wraps, the hooks, the songs, the carts, every ordinary object of plantation routine had begun to shift allegiance. This deserves to be said plainly. Systems of domination often appear strongest just before they are challenged because they mistake silence for control. But silence can be labor. Silence can be memory. Silence can be mothers positioning children under the nose of power. Silence can be a blacksmith shaving iron in increments too small for a master's eye. Silence on some nights is not surrender. It is assembly. By the last days of June 1858, the breeding farm remained outwardly intact. The ledgers were still in the office. The locks were still on the doors. The bells still governed the day. White men still slept, believing they owned the future of every child on that property. But under that illusion, the children had already begun to be reassigned, not by price, not by age, not by the appetite of traders, but by who could carry them, who could calm them, and who was willing to risk everything so they would not be turned into columns on a sale sheet. That was the hidden work. And hidden work is often where history's moral center truly lives. By July 1st, 1858, the hidden structure Isaiah Reed and Eliza May Turner had built inside the Barlow breeding farm was no longer developing in peace. Pressure had entered every corner of it. That is the point at which resistance stops feeling like planning and starts feeling like being hunted before the pursuit has even begun. The first warning came through iron. Overseer Martin Bracken arrived at the forge shortly after sunrise with 2 damaged chain links thrown into the back of a mule cart. He did not present them as routine repairs. He dropped them onto Isaiah's bench and stood there watching. 3 links on one section had been thinned at the side, not enough to break under ordinary use, but enough to weaken under strain. To a man who knew iron, the damage was visible. To a man who knew enslaved labor, the meaning was visible too. Somebody had been preparing for failure in the chain. Bracken lifted one length with the toe of his boot and asked Isaiah whether poor stock could account for it. Isaiah answered carefully. Inferior iron sometimes split. Old joins sometimes wore thin. Moisture, rust, repeated stress, those things happened. Every word was true in isolation. That is often how the enslaved survived questioning, not through invented stories, but through fragments of truth arranged to delay suspicion. Bracken did not argue. That made the danger worse. Men like him became most threatening when they stopped talking and started observing. He ordered a full count of forge scrap by noon. He checked the tool shelf himself. He made Caleb Morse from the mule barn stand nearby as witness while he turned over bins of metal offcuts with a shovel handle. He found nothing conclusive. But the inspection itself changed the terms of risk. From that morning forward, the forge was no longer merely watched. It was under active doubt. Isaiah understood immediately what that meant. No more unnecessary contact near the quench barrel. No more using the rear bench for hidden shaping during daylight. No more trusting that scrap fragments would go unnoticed if kept in familiar places. He shifted his movements without visible haste. That mattered. Sudden caution could look like guilt. So he remained outwardly steady, striking, turning, cooling, riveting, while internally recalculating every hidden object still in his control. That same afternoon he relocated 2 rough-turning slivers from the forge yard to the wagon shed, hiding one inside a cracked spoke brace and another in a fold of sacking beneath the hay cart tools. He did not move all of them. Total relocation would have been too obvious if another search came. Again, discipline, not panic. Survival under coercion often depends less on boldness than on measured adjustment, but pressure was not coming only from the forge. In the nursery quarter, Eliza May faced a different rupture. Several of the youngest children had developed bowel sickness after spoiled meal feed, and 2 infants were moved to the isolation shed on July 1, 1858. By evening, Bracken ordered that a small group of toddlers remain separated as a precaution until the clerk could inspect them again. This was a practical response in one sense, but on a place like Barlow's, even practical responses became dangerous because they disrupted known sleeping rows, known carriers, known door patterns. Every shift of a child's body from one building to another fractured the plan. Eliza May saw the threat at once. Her arrangement depended on predictability. Infants had been mentally assigned to particular women. Toddlers had been kept near older girls who could steady them. Now, separation was being imposed from above, not for mercy, but to maintain sale value and avoid visible disorder before traders arrived. The white management did not care whether sick children suffered. They cared whether sickness reduced price. Remember that clearly. Even illness was filtered through market logic. Eliza May adapted as quietly as she could. She used the evening feeding line to revise responsibilities without ever stating them openly. Ruthie Cole was shifted nearer the isolation shed under the pretense of being more patient with sick little ones. Dinah Brooks took over 2 older girls from the main barrack row so they would remain attached to the same adult if movement began unexpectedly. Miriam Tate altered the cloth wraps, placing distinguishable folds on the garments of children now sleeping apart so women could identify them in low light without speaking names. These were tiny corrections under growing strain. But tiny corrections are often what keep a fragile operation alive. By July 2nd, the farm's atmosphere had changed in a way everyone could feel and few could name aloud. White men moved faster. The clerk spent longer with ledgers open. Wagon harnesses were checked twice in one day. The north lane, which ran toward the loading side of the property, was raked and cleared of debris after supper. No official announcement had yet been made, but the sale machinery was advancing toward execution. The children felt it too. Some did not understand the reason, only the disturbance. They sensed sharper head counts, shorter tempers, more frequent inspections, less tolerance for noise. A girl called Mercy, about 8 years old, asked Eliza May whether the traders were coming for the summer wash. That was how fear appeared in children, half understood, dressed in the language of routine. An older boy, Amos, began sleeping in his clothes. One pair of twins refused to separate even to eat. These were not sentimental details, they were operational facts. Frightened children cling, cry, freeze, wander, and exhaust themselves. Any rescue involving nearly 300 of them had to account for the bodily consequences of terror. Isaiah and Eliza May met again after dark on July 2nd near the ash pit behind the smokehouse. They no longer wasted time on reassurance. The question now was how much instability the plan could absorb before it broke. He told her plainly, "Bracken is counting the forge like he expects to find intention in it." She told him plainly, "The little ones are split now and maybe more by tomorrow." He asked whether her women could still cover all groups. She answered yes, but not with the same margin as before. Then came the harder concern. What if the sale list was posted early, before every cluster was fully ready? What if inspection schedules forced children into the yard at daylight with traders present? What if the white men advanced the departure by a day because of weather or disease concerns? This is the moral ugliness such stories must not hide. Resistance under slavery was rarely a contest between a perfect plan and open evil. It was a contest between flawed timing and institutional speed. The people trying to preserve children were forced to improvise under pressure. The people selling them had the law, horses, guns, buildings, and paper. On July 3rd, another warning struck from the yard side. Ezra Pike, the enslaved hay driver Isaiah had been quietly observing, reported that one of the hay wagons designated for outer field loads had been reassigned closer to the nursery lane. At first glance, that seemed useful. In reality, it increased scrutiny. Any cart parked too near the children's quarter would be noticed if moved at an odd hour. The best cover had always depended on wagons appearing to follow ordinary routes. Now those routes were being altered by white management for their own convenience. Still, the wagons remained the strongest available concealment. There was no way to move that many children on foot from the center of the property without at least some cover for the youngest. So Isaiah shifted attention toward the remaining carts, especially one old hay carrier with a soft axle groan and deep side rails that could hold layers of loose fodder over hidden bodies. Caleb Morse confirmed that the left rear wheel on that cart tracked better in mud than the others because of an older iron band adjustment. Again, this was the texture of real preparation, wheel behavior, not fantasy. In the nursery quarter, Eliza May made her own hard adjustments. She reduced reliance on any child under 5 walking independently. She placed more of the burden on the older girls, especially Mercy, Clara Jane, and 12-year-old Hester Bell, each already accustomed to carrying infants during wash and feeding shifts. She began settling children earlier at night, not for rest alone, but to train their bodies toward quiet before the hour when movement might someday begin. She also shortened some songs. A repeated comfort sequence could keep children calm. Too much singing could draw notice from a suspicious guard. Even tenderness had to be rationed under surveillance. By July 4, 1858, the tension had become visible enough that even those outside the core alliance sensed something approaching. Men in the field rows noticed Bracken writing shorter loops with longer pauses. Kitchen workers whispered that Vernon Pike had requested more ink and clean ledger paper. A seamstress in the big house said trader cloth had arrived for wrapping tagged parcels in better garments. The rumor solidified. The sale sheet would be posted within days. That same day, a fresh crisis struck the plan. One of the smaller boys, Daniel, barely 6, was taken to the side yard after he bit a clerk's hand during inspection. He was not beaten there in public, but he was isolated for several hours and returned, shaken, watchful, and less likely to trust commands from unfamiliar adults. This mattered beyond one child. It proved that inspections were becoming more invasive and that frightened children might react unpredictably before movement even began. Eliza May had to adjust again. Daniel would now need a specific carrier or close older companion. He could no longer be treated as an ordinary walker in a group. This is what the breeding farm had done. It had produced not only suffering but logistical distortion. Every child carried a different scar pattern of fear. The rescuers had to work around traumas created by the very system they were trying to escape. On the night of July 4th, Isaiah made one of his riskiest decisions. He thinned a second set of chain links intended for rear gate restraint, not enough to fail at a glance, but enough to give under force or repeated twisting. It was dangerous work now that Bracken was alert, yet if gates could not be opened quietly, some barriers might still need to be broken under pressure. Isaiah accepted the risk because time had begun to close around them. Eliza May, that same night, walked the sleeping rows more slowly than usual. Not from sentiment. From counting. She counted heads, likely carriers, restless sleepers, sick children, walkers, those who could be guided by hand, those who would need lifting from the first minute. She was doing the work no ledger on that property ever did honestly. The clerk counted them as merchandise units. She counted them as lives requiring different forms of rescue. By July 5th, the conspiracy was still intact, but it was no longer comfortably hidden. Too many variables were shifting. The forge was under suspicion. The children's quarters were being reorganized. Wagons were being repositioned. Illness had complicated sleeping arrangements. Inspections were harder. The sale was drawing close enough to harden rumor into expectation. And yet this is the point where the moral center sharpens. The white men at Barlow Farm believed pressure made the enslaved easier to manage. In one sense, pressure did produce compliance on the surface. People lowered their eyes, moved faster, answered shorter, swallowed panic. But pressure also forces clarity. By the first week of July 1858, Isaiah Reed and Eliza May Turner knew there would be no safer future moment, no ideal conditions, no perfect alignment. The machine was accelerating. If they waited for certainty, the children would be posted, tagged, loaded, and scattered across the South. So the preparation entered its last honest form, not confidence, not hope, but readiness under deterioration. That is often how resistance actually looks before history notices it, not like a banner raised in clean air, like exhausted people making corrections inside a collapsing margin, refusing to hand over the vulnerable simply because the odds have worsened. And on the Barlow Farm, the odds were worsening by the hour. On the night of July 6, 1858, the Barlow breeding farm was still outwardly under control. The bells had rung. The ledgers had been closed for the evening. The white men had eaten, counted bodies, checked doors, and convinced themselves that order, once imposed, remained stable through darkness. That was their oldest mistake. They believed stillness belonged to them. It did not. By then, the sale list was no longer a rumor. Names and age ranges had been consolidated in the clerk's office. Final grouping was expected within 48 hours. Traders from Baton Rouge and New Orleans were said to be on the road. The children's barracks had already been reshuffled twice in 6 days. The forge had been searched. The wagons had been checked. Every sign pointed in one direction. If movement did not happen now, it would happen too late. This is the part history too often simplifies. It was not one bold decision made in a single instant. It was a series of smaller thresholds crossed by exhausted people who understood there would be no cleaner opportunity. Under slavery, rescue did not wait for ideal weather, full strength, or certainty. It moved in the narrow space left between administrative violence and total lockup. Isaiah Reed had spent the day acting as though nothing in the world existed beyond iron and heat. He repaired a mule harness bracket before dawn. He reset a wheel band at midday. He answered Bracken's questions with the dull flatness expected of a man long broken by work. But that surface obedience hid a final inventory. By late afternoon, he had confirmed which rough turning slivers remained in place, which thin saw strips could still be reached, and which rear fittings might give under pressure if opening failed. He did not imagine every door would yield quietly. He prepared for obstruction because he knew the property too well to expect mercy from wood or metal. Eliza May Turner had spent the same day inside the nursery quarter tightening the human side of the plan. She did not call children to her. She let routine do the gathering. Evening feeding came a little closer than usual. Bedding rows were settled more deliberately. Older girls remained near the smallest children under harmless pretexts. One needed help with cloth wraps, another with spilled water, another with a fretful infant. No white observer saw a conspiracy. At most, he would have seen overworked black women keeping a restless barrack quiet. The owners had trained themselves not to notice black coordination unless it arrived with noise. That night, the women already marked by Eliza May's quiet system were in place. Ruthie Cole near the isolation shed and the smallest sick children. Dinah Brooks near the middle row, responsible for the older girls and walkers. Miriam Tate with the infants and the nursing cloths. Liza Ann near the side threshold, fast enough to move between groups. Hester Bell, Clara Jane, Mercy, and a few other older children positioned not by chance, but by function. The boys old enough to understand a serious whisper, Amos, Samuel, Thomas Reed, little Daniel, despite his recent fright, had been watched for days. Not all would carry. Some would guide. Some would simply hold the hands of younger children and keep walking when told. This is what should be remembered. The movement of nearly 300 children did not begin as chaos. It began as assignment. The weather favored concealment in one sense and punished it in another. Rain had passed through St. Landry Parish late that afternoon, leaving the low lanes wet, the ground slick, the night air heavy and close. Mud would slow horses if pursuit came fast. Mud would also punish small feet, wagon wheels, and any child already weak from poor food or recent sickness. There was no good ground left, only better and worse choices. Shortly after the second night check, when the main yard had gone quiet except for insects and the occasional mule shift from the barn side, Isaiah moved first. He approached the rear nursery access under work cover already established in previous evenings. A blacksmith near hardware after dark was not impossible, especially when locks and hinges had been under inspection. But this time he did not linger. He worked by touch more than sight, easing one rough turning piece into an old warded lock on the lesser-used rear door of the children's barrack. The metal resisted, then caught, then hesitated again. That was the truth of such tools. Uncertain, crude, made in fragments stolen from a system that would have killed him for owning them. He adjusted pressure, turned once more, and felt the internal piece give. The first door opened. No shout, no splinter. Just the quiet shift of wood long used to holding children in place for sale. Inside, Eliza May was waiting. She did not waste even a second on relief. She moved immediately through the first prepared sequence. Older girls lifted the infants already assigned to them. Ruthie took the sickest toddler first. Dinah drew the walking children into pairs and narrow files. Miriam secured cloth tighter around two babies whose crying had to be prevented by warmth and closeness, not by force. Eliza May herself moved toward the second row, touching shoulders, guiding by pressure rather than voice. The children had been softened into these positions by days of routine. Now routine turned into departure. The first groups did not run. That would have destroyed everything. They flowed. One cluster out the rear threshold, another held in shadow. A third moved toward the side lane once the first had cleared. Outside, two wagons had been prepared not as obvious escape vehicles, but as ordinary hay loads left in plausible position. Ezra Pike and Caleb Morse had done what they could without ever hearing the full design spoken aloud. Loose fodder and worn canvas created cavities low in the bed spaces. Infants and the weakest toddlers went there first, hidden beneath breathing room and layered grass, not packed. Not buried. Covered just enough to break the outline from a distance. Older children moved on foot beside or behind, each line linked to one woman or one older child leader. That was another hard truth. No wagon could carry them all. Most had to walk. Isaiah moved to the next secured point, a side latch on the smaller shed where recently isolated children had been kept. This one did not yield as easily. The fitting had been changed days earlier. He used a thin metal strip first, then a saw sliver to widen the catch edge, then forced the weakened plate against the staple. The wood answered with a small crack, not loud but louder than he wanted. For a moment everyone froze. Nothing followed. No lantern swung near. No boots rushed over planks. The second barrier opened. Daniel came out in Ruthie's arms, though he was almost too big for carrying. One feverish infant followed under Miriam's wrap. Two younger children stumbled barefoot into the mud and were steadied at once by Clara Jane and Hester Bell. Eliza May absorbed them into the moving pattern without speech. By then, the line had become real. Not a plan anymore, a column of lives in motion. They moved first along the rear service strip, then toward the hay lane that cut behind the smokehouse and wagon shed. The choice was deliberate. Open yard crossing would have been quicker, but visible. The rear route was slower and fouler, bordered by storage edges, drainage cut, and brush where shadows held longer. Isaiah had measured that trade-off days earlier, time versus concealment. On that night, concealment had to win. At the first muddy descent near the drainage bend, the pace nearly broke. One wagon wheel sank to the lower rim. A cluster of walkers behind it compressed too tightly. A toddler began to whimper. Dinah turned at once, crouched, and steadied three children with nothing but hands and eye contact. Caleb and one older boy lifted the wheel while Isaiah shoved from the side brace. The cart lurched free with a wet sucking sound and moved again. That moment mattered because it showed what the whole effort truly rested on. Not a single hero, but coordinated labor under mortal pressure. The owners had built the breeding farm through organized theft of black bodies. The escape was being built in real time through organized preservation of black bodies. They reached the hay track beyond the main built yard in uneven stages. By then, more groups had joined from the children's quarter than even Isaiah had been able to see clearly in advance. The count was impossible in the dark. Eliza May tracked by clusters, not numbers. Infants with Miriam, walkers with Dinah, sick little ones with Ruthie, older girls on the flanks, Amos and Samuel helping the smallest boys through mud. Mercy gripping one child in each hand so tightly that neither could drift. No one announced courage. People simply kept moving. By the time the lead groups reached the outer cane edge lane, nearly 300 children were in motion or being absorbed into motion. Some were hidden in hay wagons. Most were walking in broken files. A few had to be carried in arms already exhausted. The women moved like people beyond panic, which is not the same as calm. Calm belongs to safety. This was discipline born of no safety at all. Eliza May took the lead once they cleared the last structure shadows. That had always been the arrangement, though perhaps only she and Isaiah understood its full importance. He knew metal, routes through the built property, points of entry and exit. She knew the living map beyond it. The ground mothers and workers remembered because they had crossed parts of it for wood gathering, washing, drainage work, and forced field movement over years. More than that, she knew how to move children, not just bodies. The difference was everything. She guided them toward the low mud road behind the north pasture, a route most white riders avoided at night because rain turned portions of it treacherous. That was precisely why it mattered. What disciplined adults feared, armed pursuers on horseback might avoid if there were easier routes to scan first. Isaiah remained toward the rear half of the movement, watching gaps, listening for any sound from the property behind them. Twice, he turned back toward the farm, half expecting lanterns already rising, half expecting the whole night to split open in alarm. But for those first critical minutes, Barlow Farm remained silent. Silent because white men were sleeping. Silent because the system that claimed total control had no idea that its central commodity had begun to disappear. Silent because the most important revolts are sometimes quiet at the start. This must be said plainly. No record kept by the enslavers would ever describe this moment truthfully. If they wrote of it later, they would call it theft, flight, disorder, loss of stock, criminal conspiracy. They would not call it what it was, a mass recovery of children from a market in human life, a mother-led extraction from a breeding farm. A blacksmith using the knowledge slavery forced into him to break the timing of sale. By midnight, the column was beyond the main yard, committed to ground that would either hide them or swallow them. There was no turning back. Too many doors had opened. Too many sleeping rows had emptied. Too many children had crossed from possession into perilous possibility. And behind them, on the Barlow property, absence was beginning to gather shape in the dark. By the time the first real absence was noticed on the Barlow farm, the column of children was already beyond the rear service lanes and into the mud track north of the pasture break. That timing mattered. Systems of captivity survive on minutes. A locked door discovered open at once can be corrected. A missing child can be chased. A missing barrack can be sealed. But when nearly 300 children and their guides have already entered darkness, distance begins to work against the enslaver. The first sign came shortly after midnight on July 7, 1858. A yard hand sent to check the isolation shed found the latch displaced and one sleeping mat empty. He called for a lantern. Another door was checked, then another. In less than 2 minutes, confusion moved from one building to the next like a spark through dry brush. The nursery row was no longer a nursery row. It was a ledger broken open. Mats abandoned, cloths missing, 2 side doors unsecured. Head counts failing to reconcile. A hay cart not where one driver expected it to be. A silence in the children's barracks so wrong it could not be mistaken for rest. Then the bell rang. Not the work bell. Not the ration bell. The alarm bell. It struck across the property in hard iron bursts, yanking men from beds, pulling riders toward saddles, forcing the whole farm to look directly at the thing it had long believed impossible. Organized black removal on a massive scale. Let this be remembered. The breeding farm, built to sort, confine, count, and sell children, had not merely lost a few bodies in the dark. It had lost control of its central crime. By then, Eliza May Turner was already leading the front half of the movement along the low mud road behind the north pasture where standing water reflected broken moonlight and every step threatened to twist an ankle or pull a child down to the shin. The route was miserable, but misery can be useful when pursuers prefer easier ground. She had chosen it because she knew where the packed ridges still held under the muck, knew which ditches had old plank crossings buried under weed, knew where a wagon could be coaxed through if the children walked the higher edge. Behind her, the line stretched and compressed in waves. Miriam Tate kept the smallest infants low and covered in the first hay wagon, checking breath by touch whenever the cart jolted. Ruthie Cole carried Daniel until her arms failed, then handed him to Hester Bell without stopping the line. Dinah Brooks managed the walkers with a severity born of necessity, tightening files whenever the ground narrowed, pushing them apart whenever they bunched too close and risked a fall. The children were exhausted before the true chase had even begun. That is the fact sentimental retellings often avoid. This was not a clean flight into freedom. It was a mass movement of hungry, frightened, half-sick bodies through mud at night, led by women whose own strength had already been eroded by years of forced labor. And yet they kept moving. Then the bell sound reached them over distance, not clearly. Not in sharp peals, but enough. Enough for the older children to understand that the farm had awakened. Enough for the women to know the last margin of secrecy was gone. Enough for Isaiah Reed, toward the rear, to turn once and see lanterns bloom behind the tree line like a second hostile constellation. That was the moment the escape ceased to be covert movement and became pursuit. The first mounted men did not catch them at once. The ground delayed them exactly as Isaiah and Eliza May had hoped. Horses dislike uncertain mud and darkness. Riders slow when low branches, hidden ditches, and waterlogged ruts threaten broken legs or thrown bodies. But the patrol did not need speed alone. It had noise, light, and the psychological power of being armed men chasing children. That alone could shatter an unsteady column, so the rear had to hold. Isaiah knew this before anyone said it. He had been doing rear control since leaving the farm, checking gaps, steadying wheels, listening for sounds behind them. But now that role hardened into something harsher. Delay, divert, mislead, buy time with position and noise if needed. He had no grand weapon, no miracle advantage, only knowledge of ground and the willingness to place himself between the patrol and the children long enough for the line to pull away. Near the drainage cut west of the pasture edge, he made the first rear action. One of the lighter carts had begun to leave a cleaner wheel mark where the mud thinned. Isaiah forced it off the firmer track and across a rougher patch where runoff split into branching channels. The maneuver nearly tipped the load, but it muddled the trail and brought confusion. He also sent Caleb Morse and an older boy to drag brush behind one stretch of walkers, blurring small foot patterns where the ground briefly hardened. These were not romantic tricks. They were practical distortions, the kind tired men invent when hunted and short on options. Up ahead, Eliza May faced her own crisis. The line was too long. Nearly 300 children could not remain one body on such ground. The wagons slowed the walkers endangered the infants when they compressed too tightly. She had known from the beginning that the route would eventually require separation by function, but now the alarm forced the decision sooner, so she split them, not into chaos. Into survival groups. The first group, the strongest walkers, older girls, and the lightest children who could sustain pace. The second, the main wagon cluster with infants, sick children, and those needing lift support. The third, a rear-moving group of older boys and women strong enough to steady stragglers. It was a brutal decision because it created distance inside the escape itself. But mass rescue under pressure is always forced into such decisions. Delay everyone for the weakest, and all may be retaken. Abandon structure and the youngest vanish first. Eliza May chose the only thing that still resembled protection. Layered movement. The path she now took was one only labor memory could have preserved. It ran through a low tract locals avoided after rain, then curved toward a cypress break where logging crews had once used a narrow service trail. White riders from the house side rarely bothered with it at night because it looked impassable unless one knew the line of firmer roots and narrow rises. Eliza May knew it because years earlier she had been forced with other women to gather fallen wood there after a storm. That is how oppression often betrays itself. The labor forced on the enslaved becomes the memory that later undermines the enslaver. Behind them, Bracken had taken charge of the first chase party. He counted fast enough to understand the scale of the catastrophe and savage enough to react without hesitation. By the time he reached the north lane, he knew this was not a handful of runaways. Too many doors were open. Too many children were gone. Too many women were missing from the nursery and service quarters. The hay carts told the rest of the story. This was coordinated. That knowledge would have humiliated him before it enraged him. Men like Bracken could tolerate human misery. They could not tolerate black competence. He split the riders, one group following the clearer wagon traces toward the North Mud Road, another circling east in case the fugitives had tried for the tree line. That too mattered. Pursuit on plantations often depended on assumptions about where the enslaved naturally would run. Isaiah and Eliza May had gambled that mud and children would make them seem slower and more desperate than they actually were. For the first stretch, the gamble worked. Then one of the rear children fell. It was Samuel, 8 years old, who had been steady until then. He went down hard near a half-flooded rut, twisted his ankle, and could not stand properly. The line behind him tightened at once. One girl turned back. A toddler started crying because the stillness felt wrong. Dinah seized the moment before it spread, lifting the toddler and ordering the nearest boys forward with nothing but eye and gesture. Samuel was half-carried by Amos and Thomas Reed for the next quarter mile, slowing the rear cluster but not stopping it. This is what saved them again and again. Not one dramatic act, but immediate labor absorbed by whoever was nearest. A little later, the first clear pursuit shout carried over the dark, then another. Then the sound no child on such a farm could mistake. Riders pushing animals harder. Isaiah stopped at the narrow rise before the cypress break and knew the rear margin was gone. If the pursuit reached the second wagon cluster before the line entered the roots and black water shadows, panic would turn the whole movement into a scattered capture field. He had to thicken the delay, so he did what blacksmiths understand instinctively. He used the environment as material. A half-rotted side rail from an abandoned drainage cart lay near the rise, along with loose plank remains from old work. He and Caleb shoved the heaviest pieces into the narrowest section of the track, not enough to stop riders completely, but enough to force dismount or sidestep in poor footing. He also cut one wagon trace loose after unloading its smallest burden forward, leaving the shell of the cart angled badly where the ground narrowed. It was sacrifice, deliberate and necessary. Better to lose a cart than 100 children behind it. When the first patrol lantern reached that bottleneck, the delay became real. Horses balked. Men swore. Light swung wildly over wet boards, roots, and abandoned wheel. In the confusion, Isaiah drove farther noise into the wrong direction, stones thrown into brush, a shouted sound off to the west, enough to suggest movement there. For a few minutes it worked. 2 men broke from the main line to chase phantoms into the dark. Minutes were everything now. Eliza May used them. She pulled the front group through the cypress break and onto the old logging trace, where the mud gave way in places to slick root and firmer leaf rot. Hard walking, but faster than open bog. The children were too tired to understand strategy, yet they followed because the women around them never let the line become still. Mercy was carrying a baby. No one had expected her to manage this long. Hester Bell had blood on one knee from a fall she never acknowledged. Ruthie, face hollow with fatigue, kept one sick child against her chest and another by the wrist as if she had grown a second spine out of pure need. Then came the cost. At the rear rise, Bracken's men corrected their course faster than Isaiah wanted. One rider found firmer side footing. Another cut around the broken cart. Lantern light struck close enough now to reveal bodies moving deeper into the cypress line. The delay had worked, but not permanently. It never could. Delay only buys time. Someone still has to pay for that time. Isaiah knew it was going to be him. There are moments in dark history when choice narrows to one brutal clarity. Stay with the line, and perhaps he lives, but the rear group may collapse under pursuit. Hold the rear longer, and the mothers and children gain distance, but he steps closer to capture or death. No speech was made. No witness later recorded noble last words. He simply turned toward Caleb and shoved him forward with the others. Go. Then he remained. Not in the open like a fool, but in the broken ground where a blacksmith's strength, a laborer's endurance, and intimate knowledge of farm hardware still had use. He pulled one of the loosened chain lengths from the sacrificed cart and dragged it across root and wheel remains where a horse might catch, then shifted into shadow near the track edge. When the first rider pressed through too fast, the horse stumbled hard enough to spill pace and light. Another mount checked itself rather than crash. Shouting followed. Confusion followed. In darkness, confusion becomes a barrier all its own. That was all the line behind Eliza May needed. Not safety. Distance. By the time the chase fully reorganized, the main body of children had gone deeper into ground the riders could no longer navigate at speed. The patrol still pursued in broken fragments, now partly on foot, now by lantern guesses and mud signs, but the clean recapture the farm had expected was gone. The escape had crossed the threshold from retrievable property to dispersed human movement. The rest of the night turned into attrition. Children wept without sound left in them. Women staggered and kept moving. The front group halted twice, only long enough to tighten cloths and rebalance carriers. One infant stopped breathing for several terrifying moments before a warming hold brought the child back. A little girl named Clara Jane lost one shoe and walked on anyway because there was no choice. Daniel, who had feared everyone after the inspection incident, refused to leave Ruthie's side and so became easier to guide than before. Toward dawn, with the eastern sky beginning to pale over the cypress edge, Eliza May led them onto slightly higher ground near an abandoned cut path beyond the worst of the mud. It was not freedom in any complete sense, not yet. There were still dangers ahead: search parties, hunger, exposure, the possibility of betrayal on any road. Many would have to be moved farther, hidden better, transferred through sympathetic black communities or marshside camps or church edges willing to risk aiding them. This story does not become clean because dawn arrives. But dawn did arrive, and with it came the first count that mattered, not the planter's count, not the clerk's count, not the trader's count. Eliza May stood in wet skirts and mud-caked hem, face gray with fatigue, and counted children by presence. Ruthie and Dinah counted with her. Miriam checked the infants. Older girls repeated names where names were known and pointed where they were not. Some children slept where they sat. Some stared blankly, too emptied by terror to understand the difference between being hidden and being owned. A few were missing from the hoped-for number. That wound stayed in the count. Some had likely broken off in the chaos, some may have been taken, some perhaps still moving with the rear remnants. Large rescues carry losses inside them, that must be said honestly, but most were there, not 10, not 20, hundreds. Children who, the day before, had existed in the ledgers as movable stock now sat in dawn light as human beings outside immediate sale. That was the victory, and it came with a price no one present needed explained. Isaiah was not among the first counted. Whether he fell back farther to mislead pursuit, whether he was seized, whether he escaped later by another line of ground, such stories often reach us only in fragments because the oppressed were denied the luxury of neat endings and the powerful had no interest in preserving their truth. What remains certain is this: the children gained the hours they needed because someone stayed behind when departure would have been safer. His labor and iron had maintained bondage for years under coercion. In the end, that same knowledge fractured the timing of the sale and opened a corridor through it. Eliza May did what the record keepers never would have done honestly. She looked at the children not for condition, age, or price, but for proof of personhood. She checked who was breathing, who was fevered, who needed water, who still had a sibling nearby, who had lost one. She made the first humane inventory many of them had ever received. This is where the moral accounting belongs. The Barlow farm had tried to turn motherhood into a management tool for profit. A mother on that farm used it instead to recover children from the market. The forge had been used to preserve locks, chains, and sail transport. A blacksmith used its lessons to unmake the schedule of captivity. The nursery songs meant to calm inventory became signals of coordinated rescue. The hay wagons meant to support plantation labor became cover for human preservation. And the dawn count, muddy, incomplete, shaken, sacred in its own hard way, reversed the meaning of number itself. For the first time in their remembered lives, those children were not being counted because someone intended to sell them. They were being counted because someone refused to lose them. That is the image history should keep. Eliza May Turner in the weak morning light of July 7, 1858, skirts soaked, hands unsteady, voice nearly gone, counting children on higher ground while the machinery behind them still screamed from the loss. Not triumphant. Not untouched, not transformed into legend by easy words. Simply a black mother among stolen children, making record where the law had made erasure. And nearby, in the absences and the scattered rear traces, remained the cost, those who delayed, those who vanished from the first count, those whose names were carried forward only because somebody chose to remember. Remember them that way. Not as symbols, not as inspiration stripped of pain, as people who moved under conditions designed to break every ordinary bond and who still chose, in mud and terror and collapsing darkness, to preserve one another. That is the accusation this story leaves behind. Slavery called itself order while organizing the sale of children. The people it tried to reduce to property produced the only true moral order in sight: protect the vulnerable, keep count of the living, and refuse the ledger's lie. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and comment with your country, city, or town below. And tell me your theory too. What do you think became of Isaiah Reed after that night, and which moment truly broke the Barlow farm? The first opened lock, the alarm bell, or Eliza May's dawn count of the children they could no longer call property?